Oh, hello.
So good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us here for the GLOBSEC City Talks 2014. My name is Kathleen Koch. I am from the United States, former longtime correspondent for CNN. So if you watched CNN back, I left there in early 2009, but you might have seen me reporting from the front lawn of the White House, from Capitol Hill, from the Pentagon. I covered natural disasters, so you might have seen me reporting on Hurricane Katrina, on plane crashes, train crashes. So anyway, I am really honored to be invited by GLOBSEC to moderate this really, really fascinating discussion, and I think it's a very important topic. And before we get started, I do want to let everyone who is watching online or back at the Kempinski Hotel know that you can submit questions online. So feel free to chime in, because we'll be taking questions from our live audience here as well as questions from online. And we want this really to be a very vigorous discussion, so we'll jump in and have a lot of involvement. So, you know, when I was asked to moderate this panel, I thought how much journalism, and especially investigative journalism, has changed over the years. When I was just a kid and getting into journalism, when I thought of investigative journalism, I thought of Woodward and Bernstein, Watergate. And when they were covering that story, you know, they took their notes on notepads and they filed their stories typed on typewriters. And Edward Snowden, when he approached journalists a year ago with his concerns about what he considered wrongdoing by Western intelligence agencies, I mean, he had gigabytes of information, 1.7 million intelligence files that he had downloaded. I mean, just processing that amount of information is incredibly difficult. Investigative reporters have always had to walk that fine line between exposing wrongdoing and corruption and jeopardizing national security. But I think the job has become so much more difficult now because of the amount and the complexity of information that's available, and the time and money now that takes even greater than ever before to sift through it and to make sense of it. And that is media revenues, media profits are shrinking, media staffs are being cut. I think there is a real question about what the future of investigative reporting is and how is it being impacted by these massive document dumps. Anyway, enough talking on my part. I've got a great panel here, really the best and the brightest on this topic to discuss it. So let me introduce everyone. We're not really seated in any particular order, but Ronan Bergman, senior correspondent for military and intelligence affairs for Israel's largest daily newspaper, Yadiot Ahronot. Ronan?
Brilliant.
Thank you. Julian Borger, diplomatic editor for Great Britain's Guardian newspaper. Edward Lucas is international editor of the international editor of the weekly magazine The Economist, and author of the book The Snowden Operation, not his newest book, he's got a newer one. And then Andrei Soldatov is an investigative journalist and editor-in-chief of Agentura.ru. It's an information hub on intelligence agencies. So welcome, gentlemen.
Thanks.
And I want to go to the audience first with a question, if we could put it up on the screen. And I believe you all have been given the ability to vote on this question. Does everyone understand how that works? All right. The question is, and it's one very much debated, obviously, in the United States right now, is Edward Snowden a hero or a traitor? So from your perspective, there's a question not up there.
I think they have to answer yes or no, don't they?
Yeah, and you answer yes or no. That's correct.
Yes.
So the question is not displayed, but I think it will be displayed when your answers are collected.
But they need to have a yes or no to hero or traitor.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's true. It's a yes or no question then.
Yes, maybe it's about hero.
Okay. All right.
So
I see. I don't know how
So if
they...
they think Snowden's a hero, they should vote yes.
Well, I think the way they phrased it is hero or traitor. How do we have it phrased?
Yes is the right answer.
Let's see.
Hero or traitor, yes.
I don't know that I have it on here. No, I have a blank screen.
Should we start talking?
Okay.
I think we'll
Well,
move
we
on.
will just jump
What about
on
show?
ahead, and hopefully as time goes on, we will figure that out and maybe get your answers. But Edward, I wanted to start with you. Obviously, we haven't quite gotten the feel of the audience and what their thoughts are on this question. But the full title of your book, The Snowden Operation, is actually The Snowden Operation Inside the West's Greatest Intelligence Disaster. So I would assume from that title, then you would come in on the traitor side.
I'm terribly old-fashioned. Hands up everyone who thinks Snowden is a hero. Hands up everyone who thinks Snowden's a traitor.
We have a lot of people abstaining. Okay.
I'm very critical of Snowden, and I've written a book which is only...
Okay, well, there we go.
The other way around.
72% said hero. It wasn't yes or no.
I'm glad
and
someone...
28% said traitor.
Well done.
Interesting.
Wow.
Okay.
I'm glad someone agrees with me. I'm very critical of Snowden. I wrote a book. It's a 99-cent Kindle single about this. And I think you have to start from the assumption that espionage is very difficult for governments to regulate because it's about breaking laws, stealing secrets, and governments are in the business of maintaining laws, at least democratic ones are. No one's going to, you're never going to get it right, but all countries that can do espionage do it. I wonder if anybody here has heard of the Kommando Strategische Aufklärung. No, it's the German NSA, it's very good at what it does. Der Spiegel, which came over all shocked about Snowden, only a couple of years previously had run an article about praising the KSR, saying it was so good at doing intelligence work, and the words privacy and legality never appeared once in that article. I think the naivety and hypocrisy surrounding the Snowden revelations are absolutely shocking, and I can go into great detail about this, but we're going to discuss lots of other things. But the idea that it's wrong for a country like Sweden to spy on a country like Russia, I simply can't understand. And in the absurd book that Glenn Greenwald has just published, one of his great sort of frothing moments of outrage is where he reveals that Sweden, with the help of NSA, spies not just on Russia, but on an innocent Russian company. Commercial espionage against this poor Russian company called Gazprom. If you know anything about Russia, you know the only argument is whether the Kremlin is the political wing of Gazprom or Gazprom is the gas wing of the Kremlin. And the idea that there's anything, I mean, we should be spying on China. China is a disgusting communist dictatorship which occupies Tibet, locks up dissidents, persecutes religious believers, and engages in all sorts of things we don't like, including very heavy commercial espionage against us. We should be spying on Russia. My goodness, we should be spying on Russia. And the Snowdenistas, they hate being called Snowdenistas, and so please use this at every opportunity because it really annoys them. The Snowdenistas have never explained why it's in the public interest to give away secrets about how democracies spy on dictatorships. I could go on at great length, and I won't, so please read my book.
All right. I'm going to jump over to Julian, because Julian, you obviously were working on the editorial staff at The Guardian dealing with Edward Snowden. I take it you have a slightly different opinion of him.
No, not entirely. I think that's right. I think we have intelligence services in democracies so that they can serve the security and defense of our countries, and spying on dictatorships like Russia and China is entirely appropriate. I mean, what our work at The Guardian focused on when it came to the Snowden files was the extent of bulk collection in the UK and the US, and that's what we focused on. Because we reasoned there was a very strong public interest in doing so, and you know, the panel that President Obama put together to review bulk mass surveillance agreed that there was a lot that was going wrong and had 40-odd recommendations a way to change it. An all-party committee in the UK has come out with a report saying that what the Snowden files show is an embarrassing indictment of the lack of oversight of the surveillance agencies by the elected legislatures. And I think that's the big picture of what's happened is that the oversight was designed in a time when surveillance meant you put a crocodile clip on a copper wire of Joe Bloggs and you listen to his conversations. But when these probes that go down into fiber optic cables that go across the Atlantic obviously suck up millions and billions of communications. And as democracies, we've never really had a conversation about that. And the various parliamentary oversight bodies weren't really across it. They weren't up to speed. And so the capabilities of the surveillance agencies had gone long and far beyond what we as democracies could get our heads around, and had a reasonable conversation about where is our trade-off between security and privacy. So that's what we focused on.
Ronan, you're a contributing writer at Der Spiegel, and you worked with them on some of their Snowden reporting. Do you believe that Edward Snowden was in any way influenced by, working with, inspired by, conspiring with the Russians?
No. Everything is possible in the world of intelligence. And if someone would come to you, and I don't know, 5 years ago, and would say that affairs like Chelsea or Bradley Manning, WikiLeaks, huge leakage of the diplomatic and the intelligence cables, and then something like Snowden would happen, you would say, this is impossible, it will never happen. But it did. When we had our discussion with Julian Assange back 3 years ago, he has some of his conspiracy theories about what the NSA is doing. Of course, he didn't have any footprint for that. And we said, Julian, listen, let's go back to the cables, because this is just far too much. And now when you see what Snowden leaked, it seems that much of what Julian Assange at that time claimed was true. So everything is possible, but I didn't see any sort of footnote, any sort of proof, any sort of indication that this is a pre-planned Soviet conspiracy, a huge intelligence operation. On the contrary, I think that the Soviet, and we should attribute FSB, the Soviet foreign intelligence, the Russian Soviet, the Russian foreign intelligence service, I think that we should attribute them to be smart and wise. If they would plan this in advance and had him as a mole inside NSA and CIA, they should have done it completely different, and not in the way that it was performed.
Are you saying it was too clumsy? It didn't have their
the whole thing of flying with Sarah Miller to Hong Kong and then trying to ask asylum from the Chinese, and then depending on whether the Russian would take them or not, etc., etc. I want to say, going back to what was just said about the group of journalists, especially, and I know something about the work that was done by Der Spiegel, are making the differentiation between what the NSA, together with GCHQ and others, were doing against the sort of the real bad guys, the Chinese, the Russian, the Iranian proliferator, Al-Qaeda, Global Jihad, Hamas, Hezbollah, all these targets. There's much in the material relating to that was not published. And there is a very close distinction and differentiation between what the NSA, American intelligence, is doing against the real bad guys, and what is done that can be seen as a violation of privacy and as following and hacking and collecting material on your friends. You can justify spying on Swedish spying on Russia or American spying on Chinese, but how can you justify hacking into the email account of the chairman of the International the World Animal Association. Are the cats your enemies? The dogs? Who are your enemies there? Why are you hacking to their email? They did it because they can. That's the reason. They collect this vast amount of information because they could do that. And as Julian said, there was not enough supervision on what they did.
Julian, did you want to jump in here?
I did, just on the issue of a plant. Presumably, if the Russians and Chinese had a plant, then they would be well served by keeping them in place, sitting in Hawaii, and continuing to fund flow of information. And you know what? I bet they do, because by the simple law of averages, we were told by the UK Cabinet Office that the GCHQ trove of documents was accessible in the US to
GCHQ, did you
GCHQ, which is the Britain's NSA, Britain's
intelligence
electronic intelligence surveillance signals intelligence. It's been seen by 850,000 people. More than half of those were private contractors like Snowden. They rolled their eyes and said, "What can you do?" They weren't happy about it when they only realized it when this came up, because GCHQ wanted to be best friends, but everything in common cloud with the NSA. But the post 9/11 culture in US intelligence is share. And so, like the WikiLeaks, which was several million, this trove was 850,000 people. And like I say, more than half of those were private contractors. Now, that just seems to me incredibly lax. That's one of the things that has changed because of Snowden. They've had a rocket up their behinds, and they are looking at that again, because that is not a way to run intelligence.
Well, Andre, I think it's time we go to the Russian on our panel.
The only Russian journalist here.
So Edward Snowden, we know he is in Russia somewhere. I have to ask, do you know where? Have you seen him? And what is your take on this whole discussion?
I'm quite in a peculiar situation, because I'm a Russian journalist based in Russia, and Snowden is in Russia. And I would say that, yes, we are quite, as Russian journalists, we are quite critical of Snowden for many reasons. And one of them, maybe the first one, is that when Snowden landed in Moscow, he decided not to talk to Russian journalists, and still it's absolutely impossible to talk to him and to interview him. He conducted only one interview. Actually, it was not an interview, but press conference, but actually he collected not journalists, but human rights activists chosen by the Kremlin. Actually, the decision who should attend this meeting was made not by Snowden, by some people in the Kremlin. And still...
What does that tell you?
Actually, I know these human rights activists. I know that they were called by some people close to the administration and told to go to a specific place at the airport. The problem is that the situation with Snowden now is very far from being transparent. And we know for sure that he is protected and heavily protected by the FSB, that he lives in a controlled environment, that his communications, his meetings are under control, because the only spokesperson, Russian spokesperson of Snowden, who is actually allowed to make comments about Snowden, Anatoly Kucherena, a Russian lawyer, he's also, by coincidence, a member of the public committee council within the FSB, the Russian Secret Service. And of course, it's it makes the whole situation a bit murky for us. Also, the problem was for many months which passed that Snowden and his supporters restrained themselves from giving any comments about the situation in Russia in terms of surveillance. And I think this point is much more important, because
he asked that question of Vladimir Putin.
He asked his question,
month.
And that might be...
So he has brought it up, though the answer...
Yes, the problem is that he asked his question. He actually was allowed to ask his question, but because he asked this question so late, for all these months before this press conference, we just saw in Russia how Russian officials played with arguments made by Snowden.
I was going to say, it looks like he's absolutely playing into their hands.
It was so clear. For example, we got examples when some new restrictive measures on the internet were promoted and approved by Russian authorities under pretext of protecting personal data of Russian citizens. We got huge pressure on global platforms like Google and Facebook under pretext of protecting personal data of Russian citizens. Just 2 weeks ago, we got the new law, and one of the requirements of this law is to store data on Russian soil. So the idea is to somehow to force Facebook and Google to relocate their servers to Russia. And again, as a reason provided by Russian authorities, the Snowden's revelations. Actually, even during this interview when Putin responded to this question of Snowden, before this question was placed by Snowden, Putin was asked by a Russian journalist, and it was already clear how Putin tried to play himself with Snowden's revelations. He was asked, why you, Mr. Putin, when you deliver your Crimea speech, decided to address not to Western governments, but to Western peoples? And Putin said something like, well, we see that Western countries lost their sovereignty, and now it's extremely hard to talk to Western officials because they are afraid of US eavesdropping. And only afterwards, Snowden appeared and was allowed to ask his question. So of course for us it's quite a depressing thing, but nevertheless I think that when he was allowed to ask this question, nevertheless it was a positive thing, because now we can start discussion about what's going on in Russia. I myself, I've been focusing on covering and exposing Russia's surveillance state for the last 3 years, and I would say that it was extremely difficult to start this discussion in Russia.
What did you think of Putin's answer? We don't.
No,
we
actually,
don't do
he provided some keys. He said that Russia cannot conduct mass surveillance, and that was not true, because Russian system of communication interception is much more intrusive than what you have in the United States or in Britain or in Europe. Just legally, it's absolutely different. Maybe the reason is that the Russian system of communication interception was actually defined in 1980s, back in the Soviet times, when constantly updated, but the foundations are still the same. So that's why I think it was a positive thing, because now we can start talking about these things.
Edward, you're chomping at the bit.
Yes. I think this Russian connection is very interesting, and I'm afraid I don't quite agree with what Julian was saying and Ronan before, that if the Russian intelligence agencies want to spy on NSA, which I'm sure they do, they have plenty of other ways to do it other than Snowden. So the fact that Snowden did what he did doesn't mean they're not doing something else. And we can't know this for certain, but there are 4, I think, dots which are incontestable. Snowden is the sort of person that the Russians love to recruit. Naive, young, slightly unbalanced, not very well trained junior intelligence officer. Behaving in a very conspicuous way when working for the CIA in Geneva. The Russians are very good at recruiting people under false flags. They wouldn't have needed to approach him saying we're from the Russian Foreign Intelligence Agency or from the GRU, for military intelligence. They could have approached him and said we are enthusiasts for digital freedom. They play very long games when they recruit people. They sometimes warm people up for 5 or 10 years. It's absolutely not unusual for them to work on people slowly. So that's not dot number 2. He was the sort of target they would like, and he was sort of, and they had means to do it. What he did hugely served Russia's interest. Russia's trying to play divide and rule in the West. This has been the biggest divide and rule imaginable. It's divided Europe and America. It's divided European countries among themselves. It's discredited Western governments and intelligence agencies in the eyes of the eyes of the public. So from an objective point of view, it's hugely been beneficial to Russia. And fourthly, he's now in Russia where we can't talk to him. And no one's really explained why this secrecy is necessary. You know, sure, okay, he doesn't want to be arrested, he can't live in the West. That's understandable. You could even argue, which I wouldn't agree, that the only place he could go to safely was Russia. But why this secrecy? Why does he live in a government safe house? Why is he the only way of getting to him through an FSB lawyer? That's really strange. Those are 4 dots. You can join them up any way you want. To me, it looks very fishy.
Well, I don't want us to get stuck on Snowden. I'd like to talk about these massive document dumps a la Chelsea Manning, Julian Assange, and WikiLeaks. And any of you jump in here. How has that changed your jobs as investigative reporters? or editors?
Well, I guess it means a lot of the work is done in rooms without windows, and just sitting for hours on end looking through documents and seeing what is relevant, what's important. It's doesn't have any of the glamour of old-fashioned Woodward Bernstein. So it's a
secret
different
meetings
kind
in parking garages.
and there is an element in which that is part of the future that with so much huge amounts of information accessible through a computer terminal, you can go exploring the world from your bedroom or your living room. And this is something I wanted to talk about in terms of the new face of investigative journalism. You have this site called Brown Moses, who was a guy who used to, he was an administrative worker and he got made unemployed, and so his name is Elliot Higgins. He went.
And he's in the U.S.?
No, he's in the US, UK, in Leicester. And he goes home and he starts looking at these huge number of YouTube videos coming out of Syria, and starts looking at them, and because there is a debate going on about what they proved, and he starts just looking at them in a very systematic way, taking a very sort of systematic approach to analyzing them and comparing the kind of weapons that he can see with online references on what is what. He soon becomes the world's leading expert on what's happening in Syria militarily, just by sitting in his room and just doing what the intelligence services are also trying to do, open source analysis.
Is this a new model of investigative
It's
journalism?
a model, yeah, because it's a model for the internet age in terms of just doing bulk data analysis and coming out with really interesting results, and factual results. He does something else to ascertain the authenticity of these YouTube videos, because every time there was a massacre in Syria, there would be a sort of a pushback against it. Oh, it's all been staged and so on. He was able to prove fairly decisively that they weren't, by plotting what you could see in terms of buildings, minarets, and so on in the video. Then go to Google Satellite and look at where the video was purported to come from, at the town, and seeing if what you could see in the video matched where the mosques were, where the significant buildings were. And just by doing it very systematically, built up a model where he could do video analysis in a way that I've heard firsthand that our own UK intelligence agencies were impressed by, in terms of just pushing the boundaries of what's possible with open source.
Let me ask, because as far as I understand, he had no military background, no training. Why is this something, though, that just a random individual is doing? Why isn't a journalist with some background, military, whatever, at a major newspaper or network doing this kind of work?
I think he had two sort of big advantages. He was unemployed, so didn't have anything else to do. In terms of, no one was asking him to do something else, and he said it. I am OCD. It was just right for him, and so those two things came together, and what was going on in the background. This disputed picture of what was going on in Syria, and those things came together and made him an important voice, an important authority.
Ronan?
I think what happened with WikiLeaks proved that technology changed a lot. First, the ability of a source to take out mass quantities of information. It took Vasily Mitrokin, the deputy chief of the KGB archive, 20 years to copy, by hand, to copy 600,000 documents, and then gave them to first he gave it to the American, who thought it's useless, and then he gave it to MI6, who smuggled KGB archive outside and gave them for publication. But this took a lot of time, and every time he had one document in his shoe. Now you can have one disk, as Chelsea Manning, he loaded the disk as if he was listening to Lady Gaga, and he was moving his head with the earphone, so as if he was listening, but basically he was downloading the content of the American intelligence computer. But so first, thanks to technology, a source can take a lot of information quite easily out of where he works. Second, he can easily send it through the internet to his purpose. He can maintain anonymity. Now, both of them at the end are exposed. Chelsea or Bradley Manning because he did a mistake and told this to a loyal friend who went to the FBI. And Snowden because he decided that he doesn't want to be anonymous. But they could, if they
Had
remain,
chosen or
had
been
shown
more careful.
different or behaved differently, they could remain anonymous until today, and we wouldn't have known who is that big throat. And it enables for a journalist, if the journalist agrees, as Julian Assange agreed, not to demand the identity of the source to be identified to himself. However, after saying all that, it went back to traditional journalism, because when Julian Assange wanted to have an international legitimacy for what he publishes, he went to these three main news entities, media outlets, the Guardian, the New York Times, and the Spiegel, and he gave them the information and basically said, look, I cannot deal with so much material. I don't know how to read so many documents. I want you to read them. I want to analyze them. I want you to give them to your readers, but not as raw material, because this raw material, if you just dump it on the internet, means nothing. You have to understand, and you have to have good people. You have to have investigative journalists and editors to understand and analyze them, and also to reduct what can cause danger to human lives. So after all these technology advances, at the end of the day, he went back to traditional journalism, to investigative journalists, and said, you are the ones who are capable to deal with this kind of material.
I think it's a very good point, because we had an example in Russia some years ago, actually in 2010, when some FSB officers, rogue officers, unhappy officers with their leadership, decided to launch a website, and they posted online top secret FSB documents about intelligence operations conducted primarily in Ukraine, by the way. And it was fascinating collection of documents, and it exposed not only how FSB operated in Ukraine, but also the lack of coordination between different intelligence services of Russia. Like, for example, FSB forged one document, and SVR, which is Foreign Intelligence Service, reported this document to the Kremlin as genuine. And FSB guy just asked it very quietly, can you say these guys, our colleagues, that it's not actually a true document?
So what happened? Did Russians go on the site? Did they visit
the
it?
problem was that nobody in Russia decided to report and to pick up these documents and to report them. So
the major media ignored the website?
Yeah, major media ignored them, and these documents were not checked. And I think it's very unfortunate, because actually even now it has a lasting effect. One of the guys who was caught in Kiev in February, and we know the story that some FSB generals were in Kiev in February 2021. One of these guys was actually signed most of the documents exposed back in 2010 about these operations in Ukraine. But nobody picked up this information. The website actually was alive only for 2 weeks. When I was told by my sources that people who were behind this website were caught, arrested by the FSB, that was the end of the story. These documents never landed in the public area. So in some way, you just need to understand how essential is the support of strong traditional media.
Edward.
Yes, first of all, I think it's interesting that both Assange and Greenwald started off being super skeptical of journalism, which they saw as being compromised, collaborative, not to be trusted. And in the end, they did realize that there was that these huge data dumps are only useful if people make sense of them, and I think that's true.
They must be put in context.
But I'm very skeptical of documents on their own. I think that the idea that a document has an unambiguous meaning is a basic mistake in journalism. When you look at a document, you have to ask all sorts of questions. How do I know this is true? Is it a forgery? Secondly, is it still valid? Was it created perhaps for one purpose that is now no longer no longer valid? Was it part of a training exercise? Is it a hypothetical? This is something we could do. So you need to ask all sorts of questions about a document. Who made it? Who is it aimed for? In what circumstances? Why do I think this matters? Is the reason why I think this matters actually the reason why someone else might think it matters? And so simply just taking a document which has secret on the top and saying this is in itself a news story is a big danger. And I think with both the WikiLeaks documents and the Snowden documents, they've been a bit of a distraction from what I think is real journalism. Real journalism is going and talking to people and getting people to tell you things where they may not realize the importance of what they're saying, and you put it together, and then you make a story out of it that explains something. And documents have a role to play in that, but and if I may, I'll just give a couple of examples. There was a very good WikiLeaks telegram about Russian organized crime and its role in Moscow city government. And when I first read it, it had all the sources were just XXX. This is in the days when the people publishing it were still trying to protect the sources. And I read it, I thought this is really interesting. This shows that the American embassy in Moscow, which has always told me that I was exaggerating when I talked about the criminality of the Russian government, actually thinks exactly what I do. So that was kind of interesting. But so on. Two, it showed that American diplomats write really, really well. And I actually tried to contact the author of the thing, and I said, if you want to come work for The Economist, we might have a job for you, because this is really good writing. But so who cares? But what was interesting, who are these really high-level sources? They talked to people who obviously really knew this XXX. I got really excited by this. I was trying to work out, how do they get people to tell them this stuff? And then, due to the incredible incompetence of the people involved in WikiLeaks, the unredacted version of the cables came out, which was catastrophic, had very serious personal consequences for various people whose names were then mentioned as people who talked to American diplomats, and that was very bad. But one of the results, you could then see who they talked to. It's like a guy at a think tank, a journalist on the Moscow Times. These are all people I knew. And so suddenly it stopped being interesting after all. It was just a lot of people had said to American diplomats the same thing as they say to me. And the American diplomats had written something that was pretty good in Economist English and stamped secret on it and sent it to Washington. And it was pretty much what I'd have written if I was writing about Moscow organized crime and its relationship with the government. And somehow it stopped being interesting after that. And so I think there's, and similarly with a lot of some of the Snowden stuff, once you know the context, and this was a training slide, and this was a hypothetical, this was something that was one bit of NSA showing off to another bit of NSA, and suddenly you start, once you find out a bit more about it, you stop thinking this is quite as interesting as it might have been. I'm not saying all documents are useless, not at all. They can be very interesting indeed, but it's absolutely vital to do the human reporting, to put it in context, and with this very top secret stuff, that's really difficult, because you can't go to the NSA or GCHQ or someone and say, hey, I've got this super top secret document, and anyone who touches it should really be in jail. So please can you tell me the circumstances in which you created this document, why it was meant? Of course they're not going to say anything. And so this document just sits there in thin air. You can't do the sort of journalism that you ought to do to make sense of it.
But that's the same claim that historians usually make, but the other way around. Because if you write history, then academics will usually tell you that that you should use written sources and prefer them upon oral sources. And there's a long time debate, and of course the combination between the two is the right thing to go. But I don't think that to say that you prefer to have oral sources, because this is a good example of how journalism works, means that written sources are less valuable or authentic or reliable. And at the end of the day, if you go to everything that was published either by Snowden or by WikiLeaks or the cables that Bradley Manning published, at the end of the day, though there's a strong dispute whether the journalist or Julian Assange or others should have published them, there is no dispute about their authenticity and about their reliability. Now, the fact that the sources that you mentioned in that specific cable are not reliable by itself is interesting, but the fact that such a document exists means that at a certain point of time, the American intelligence community believed that these should be reliable, or this is reliable information that was given them by these or that sources. Now, to have the context is important.
I totally disagree.
But you cannot, this is good, but it's good to have corroboration or understand the context, but this goes to any sort of document. You need to know when you write about the Second World War, what was the context in which the document was written. Not just with WikiLeaks.
Can I just say that I completely agree with Ed that the document is a starting point. Is a starting point. What does it mean? What's the context? I can talk in terms of the Snowden. That's how it worked with us. That there were a lot of conversations with NSA, with GCHQ, with Cabinet Office. There was lots of to and fro. There was discussions with people who used to work in these agencies and in SOCA, which is serious organized crime, and we knew from the get-go that we were, what we thought it was is what it was, and in terms of the big stories, in terms of the big bug collection. I totally agree that a document on its own does just hang in space without context, and half the document you start with is the starting point.
And you need to have investigative journalism to understand what
and that's why
means.
it is investigative journalism rather than just data management.
Let's take a step past the documents, because obviously you can have great documents. You may know that they're valid, the information contained is relevant, that they're important to put out. But depending on the country where you were trying to do investigative journalism, you may be able to report that or not. I mean, in the United States, we have freedom of the press guaranteed in our First Amendment. Journalists cannot be forced to reveal their sources. It's not the same in every country. And I know, obviously, in Russia for many years, there was the media was owned and operated by the Communist Party or the government. Talk to us a little bit about that, Andre, about the difficulty of doing investigative reporting in countries where the media was either owned or operated by the government, the party, and is still perhaps seriously influenced by it.
Well, the problem is that it seems that as the government always changes its tactics, how to deal with journalists, and back in the early 2000s, the idea was to put direct pressure on journalists, and that was the first time when I was summoned for interrogation by the FSB in 2002, and it was very straightforward. They just tried to intimidate me, my editor. They seized my computer, raided the offices of our newspaper.
You were charged?
Yeah, they tried to charge me with disclosing state secrets when they found out that I cannot disclose any secrets because I have no security clearance. Anyway, they tried hard, and it was not the only attempt, and it was quite a common thing. When slightly they changed the tactics, and now it's mostly about editors and owners than about government and journalists. And now if you try to publish something sensitive in Russian media, the first who would tell you that maybe it's too sensitive, maybe it's too dangerous for us.
Your own editor?
Yeah, it would be
We'll
an
say
editor.
we're not going to touch this. It's too sensitive, too dangerous.
Yeah, that's why I say 12 years ago.
Self-censorship.
Yeah, to be frank, the government was very skillful in imposing self-censorship on editors and journalists. And say 12 years ago, every major news outlet in Moscow used to have an investigative department. And now, some months ago, we tried to count how many investigative journalists we have in Moscow. And we counted only 6. Maybe it's about 7. Maybe
How troubling is that?
So don't drive in the same car, all of you.
Yeah, don't forget, don't go on the same plane. Yeah.
Yeah, and also the problem is, even with these 6 journalists, is that their news medias are mostly try to focus themselves on financial investigations, and they try not to touch political things. And say
It's a matter of self-preservation then?
something
The few who are left?
Yeah, maybe that's why it's impossible now to publish anything sensitive about secret services or political stuff. And when we need to publish something, when we have something at hand, we first need to find the Western publications to get it published, and then maybe after that it would be published in Russia. For example, the last story we broke the story about the system of surveillance at the Sochi Olympics, and we broke this story in The Guardian, and only after that it was picked up by some Russian media. So it's quite a common practice now in Russia, and of course it's not very helpful. because you cannot, well, pressure the Guardian to publish every story every week. It's just impossible. You cannot turn the Guardian into a Russian newspaper. Maybe, but that's the biggest problem.
Now, Ronan, I think I was surprised to learn that even in Israel, you have severe constraints when it comes to investigative journalism, reporting on military intelligence. Talk to us about how all that works.
Yeah. When Israel was established in 1948, they absorbed the British law, the British men that ruled Israel until 1948. And there was a set of law that the Brits had for their colonies, the native, that's us, which basically called for the statement of a situation of emergency. And underneath that, there's a set of laws that are completely undemocratic, and one of them is the ability of the establishment of the government to order the submission of everything published pre-publication on intelligence, Middle East, terrorism, espionage, military issues, to a pre-scrutiny by military censorship.
Every single thing.
Every single word that we publish or we air in television on these issues, and there's a list, a far more detailed list of 23 topics, needs to be submitted to military censorship and cleared by them. I have sometimes a weekly, sometimes daily argument with censorship. They take a lot, everything considering, for example, on the Israeli nuclear arsenal is deleted. Everything on extrajudicial killing of the Israeli Mossad, when it happens outside the borders of Israel, it's deleted.
And you're working on a book on Mossad,
yeah,
right?
I just finished
How's
the book.
How's that going? Okay.
Well, it's under editing in
Did they leave anything
in New York. No, it's, they haven't seen that yet. But the book is twice the size needed. So one of the editors in New York in Random House had an idea. Let's give that to military censorship into half, and it'll save us a lot of work.
They'll do it for free.
But of course, they will cut the interesting parts.
But then you print the interesting bits. Print the bits that they've cut out.
Then you'll know what's interesting.
They had a glimpse over the book censorship, and they already said that this is the most problematic. This is the history of Mossad, and it's the most problematic book they have ever seen. I asked this to be given in writing, so I'll as a blurb on my book. But seriously, there's so much taken out that if, for example, hypothetically, it won't happen, but if tomorrow censorship in Israel is banned, is disassembled, I can take at least a 5 years leave, a vacation, and just enjoy everything that was deleted so far, because there are really sensational stories there.
And you've saved them all.
And well, it's saved somewhere.
They're on a thumb drive.
It's saved somewhere because the other law that is being used against we're a small group of these journalists who do not accept the authority of censorship and the establishment point of view that everything is secret. There's another paragraph which basically, under the title of espionage, aggravated espionage, the holding of classified material. So basically, once they can prove that you hold classified material,
even if you've done nothing with it.
If you have not done just the holding of that, they can throw you to jail for 7 years. Or the maximum sentence for that is 7 years. So the administration, the establishment is trying to work to disrupt my work, and I was
you told me you've been, they tried to arrest you?
Yeah, arrest, interrogate, hack my computer. They followed me, they tried to find my sources. They tried to do whatever they can in order to stop me from getting the material out, which makes things life much more interesting and tough and frightening, but also exciting. And I think that in many of the cases, we were able to get the important stuff out.
I want to go to the audience now before we run out of time. Why don't we do we have a microphone and questions? All right, why don't we go up here and then we'll...
I just want to come back on that.
Well, why don't you go ahead and chime in while we get the microphone?
I think that in Britain we wish we had the First Amendment, and one of my jobs at The Economist is dealing with our libel laws, and I spent a year of my life organising the defence of The Economist against a very rich, unpleasant person who sued us, and it cost us £500,000 just in order that we didn't have to apologise and didn't have to pay him anything. And so this is a huge problem in Britain and also Ireland. We would love to have the First Amendment, but my impression is that this administration is the toughest on journalists that we've ever had. This makes Richard Nixon seem like nothing.
Exactly, journalists and leakers.
Yes. So I mean, there's the war on whistleblowers, which is one thing, and I think I myself have been the subject of a NATO leak inquiry, and I've broken stories based on classified in information. And I think that democracies also should have secrets and should be allowed to defend them, including with the criminal law. So I see both sides of it. But my impression is that the First Amendment's been chipped away with even Fox News. The Fox News.
James Rosen.
Just Google these cases. They're quite alarming.
They're fascinating. There have been more charges brought by the Obama administration against. I said leakers. I should say perhaps whistleblowers, because what has happened, there have been several cases of people who worked for the intelligence services who have tried to expose what they consider wrongdoing, violations of law within their agencies. But whereas other government employees in the United States are protected to go out and whistleblow and reveal wrongdoing, waste, malfeasance within their agencies, if you work for an intelligence service, you don't have that protection.
I think that's right.
Isn't that convenient?
I think that's right there. And you have to have that.
Wow. So let's say, didn't we have a question up here? The young lady here? No? I saw you raise your hand. What about questions? Any from our audience? One here in the middle then. Okay. And also, if we could put up on the screen our questions that may have been sent in, because this, I'm not getting any on this pad. Or if someone wants to check it for me.
It's turning on now.
Maybe people can re-vote to see if they
go
change their votes.
Okay, go ahead.
I would just like to ask about organized crime. It was mentioned only once. Also yesterday there was a discussion about new threats, and the organized crime was missing from the equation, and sometimes it's also missing in these discussions about overclassification, the breaches of privacy, and let's say spying on friends. But you see some kind of like a nexus between hackers or hacktivists and whistleblowers. They are criminalized, maybe more. But then a similar kind of thing on the security side of the spectrum, let's say, of terrorists, and some kind of nexus or kind of thing where you are omitting the organized crime, and let's say the tens of thousands of murders happening, let's say in South America, drug-related crime. And okay, the whistleblowers are criticizing the infrastructure that is built, let's say by NSA, by others. But then the good question is, okay, can this infrastructure be misused, let's say, by the organized crime? Or if the leaking, how does it affect the fight against organized crime? Because this is, I think, something that maybe also NATO or something could kind of focus more on. Let's say we are really putting a lot of resources into fighting terrorists, but we kind of don't consider organized crime the same kind of level of threat. But I think it's kind of the two sides of the same coin in a way, somehow, maybe. Yeah, it depends.
Right. Thank you. All right, gentlemen, anyone want to?
Yeah, if I may, I think it's an extremely good point, especially about Russia, especially for Russia, because in Russia we had two periods of. I think it's quite interesting that in the 1990s, Russian oligarchs used to have huge private armies, huge private security services, and they needed to spy on someone, like their competitors or some journalists. They used these private groups of people. And what happened next? In the 2000s, this strategy and tactics completely changed. We got now the situation when we got some court cases about illegal eavesdropping. In all these cases, just on the line, in all these cases, we see people from law enforcement. Now, for the oligarchs in Russia, it's much more cheaper. It's just to hire some people, bribe some people inside, say, inside of the Interior Ministry or inside of the FSB, and to ask them to spy on you. And given the impenetrable station of the FSB, that it's absolutely impossible to understand whether you are spied or not, well, it gives enormous opportunities for organized crime. because you just can harvest people. Don't need to buy this equipment. You are not. You're relatively safe. You cannot be accused of anything, well, actually, because it's all about the FSB. They would do all this dirty job. So I think it's extremely important.
Yes,
Edward.
I think one of the huge things that's happening, which we haven't got to grips yet, is the way in which crime has become, the crime as a service, particularly internet crime as a service, that you can go online and you can buy the services of criminal hackers to do anything from what you might call hooliganism, DDoS attacks, things like that, through to planting malware onto computers and what we used to call hacking. And a lot of government, these people are working for governments and for crime groups. And so the boundary between crime and business and government is blurring very much on this. And I think it's very serious. And from a journalistic point of view, I think it's probably true to say that more journalists are killed by gangsters than are killed by governments by some way. And investigating governments is dangerous and difficult, and you may get interrogated or possibly even charged or arrested, and in very few cases go to jail or be killed. If you turn your attention to organised crime, you may find things get much nastier much more quickly.
Do we have another audience question here? Okay, one right over here.
Good afternoon. My name is Veronica Michola, and I would like to ask you a question. I was really glad we started the topic about Edward Snowden, but what struck me really weird was that the question was whether Edward Snowden was a traitor or hero. Why didn't we look at the fact that the NSA or GCHQ is right spying on us? And to me, as a pub, at your university, we were discussing why there's no. I don't think there's enough discussion about this topic, and I think it's really serious that there are organizations and institutions that are able to spy on all of us, and then they spy on not only from the security reasons, but also from another reason why they were spying on Brazil and other countries which had nothing to do with terrorism. So my question is, why do you think there's enough discussions, not amongst journalists, but also amongst public?
Yeah, well, I think if you want to, you can go into politics on a policy of unilateral espionage disarmament. You can say espionage is inherently wicked, involves breaking the law, stealing secrets, deceiving people, telling lies, all the rest of it, and we shouldn't do it. And that is a bit like pacifism. It's intellectually defensible. I don't think it would work, and I don't think people would vote for you, but you're welcome to try it. If you think that you are going to have intelligence agencies, then they're going to work in ways that may seem quite strange to an outsider. You may have a reason for doing a particular operation which makes complete sense within the agency, but looks really strange outside. You may be spying on a particular company because there's somebody in that company who you think is working for another intelligence agency, and so you go to quite big efforts in order to target that person. And everyone else will say, why are you attacking the World Federation of, donkey botherers or some other organization? And the reason is there's an intelligence target there, and you're never going to be able to say publicly why you do it. So all you can really do is to say, let's have the best system of intelligence oversight we can. If you're going to have an espionage agency, then you've got to have oversight. My view is that America has the toughest system of intelligence oversight of any country in the world. You've got two committees, far tougher than you have here in Slovakia, for example. Two committees, Senate and House Intelligence Committees, plus the FISA court, plus regular contested elections in which all sorts of politicians of both stripes win. Now, you may think it should be even tougher. Actually, I don't. I think it's probably too intrusive, and I would like to keep politicians more away from it. But there is no other country in the world which gives such tough scrutiny to its intelligence agencies as the United States.
I don't know if that's entirely true. I just thinking
Maybe
about
Costa Rica.
Well, I don't know enough about sort of Northern European, but just thinking about the Senate Intelligence Committee, they didn't have sufficient oversight to really get to grips with torture, the CIA torture. That was a big failing, and it turned out that while they were trying to look into it, the CIA were spying on them, trying to look into it, which made Dianne Feinstein very cross. As we found out in the UK, that all the architecture of oversight can be there, but it's not necessarily effective oversight, and that depends very much on how asleep or otherwise at the wheel the various politicians in the committees are. Now, in the US, you had one or two members of the Senate committee, like Ron Wyden, who were jumping up and down, and Dianne Feinstein saying, basically, no, everything is fine, I've been assured. And Dianne Feinstein is the one that's changed her opinion. So, I think that the architecture of oversight can be there without it being there in reality.
I agree it could certainly be better. And I think you're absolutely right on the torture issue. I'm not at all arguing that America's perfect on this. I'm just saying that espionage is inherently extremely difficult for governments to supervise because it's A, secret, and B, involves law breaking. And I don't think, and if you want, and I don't think you can name a country that has this trifecta, the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary, all doing intelligence oversight the way America does. And I genuinely don't know of a country that does it that has a more elaborate and more intrusive system. But that's not to say that America gets it right.
But if you talk with the people from these committees off record, they would tell you that some of them would tell you, of course, up front they would close their ranks and support NSA, and in all the press conferences, interviews, etc., they would say that yes, this is our struggle against terrorism and what we had to do post September 11, etc., etc. But when you speak with them off record, on one-on-one level, some of them would say, we didn't know all that, we didn't understand what they are doing, we didn't understand that they are collecting this bulk of data and metadata, we didn't know how easy is it for each of the just a young and low-level desk intelligence analysis to access all this material. We didn't know all that, and some of them would tell, we felt betrayed. You say that it is hard to supervise the intelligence services, but it is like there's no one else to supervise the intelligence but the politicians. You have if it's hard to have intelligence services to supervise them, then I don't know what would be the solution for that. You cannot just launch them wild, because everything that we know about the intelligence proves that when they can do something and they are not supervised, they will do that. When they can collect vast intelligence, they will collect it because it's there, because it's easy to collect. What Snowden, I think his most disturbing revelation was the ability of every junior intelligence officer in NSA, according to his claim, yet to be checked.
Never verified.
Partly verified and partly not. I'm talking about after speaking with NSA and Senate committee, that every junior or every low-rank intelligence officer and analyst has access to bulk of material about, not just about American citizens, but about the rest of the world. And he can not just do it now, but he can date it back 20 years ago, or in 20 years he would be able to pull out material and information about someone and frame someone and identify this someone as a target, because if you take each one of us and you go 20 years on the timeline, you will find something that could identify him as a potential target for further surveillance. And this is a real threat for democracy.
I worry we ought to be talking about journalism. I'm very happy to respond.
Well, I would love to try to go to some of our questions that are online. Do we have that ability or no?
Look, they're there.
Okay, well, we have more in the room, or well, let's see. Let's pull one off the screen. What role does the media have in the current Ukraine-Russia conflict?
Can I answer that? Yes.
It's not really investigative reporting, but any thoughts there?
We made a big mistake in 1991 when communism collapsed, which was that we thought that money was neutral and that free speech would take care of itself. And what we've learned since then is that both those assumptions are wrong. Money is not neutral, and the Kremlin is using money to attack our security system, our democracy, our freedom, our values. And they're also waging information warfare against us far more effectively than the Soviet Union ever did. We have got a massive, very successful Russian information warfare effort going on right now. If any of you haven't done this, just go home and turn on your computer and go to rt.com and watch it for an hour, and you'll see what I'm talking about. And we have no answer to that. We don't do defense, we certainly don't do offense, and we are being knocked all over the place. And what's been happening in Ukraine beautifully exemplifies how Russia uses information warfare in a way to demoralize and corrode the other side's willpower and decision-making ability so that they win the war before it's even started.
I would say I'm not so impressed by Russian propaganda, especially in the West, but I would say that inside of Russia, now it's extremely difficult for Russian audience to get information about what's going on, really what's going on in Ukraine. And because most of the media are suppressed, and now we are talking not only about investigative journalism, but also about reporting. Even reporting is not, free reporting is not allowed, and we just a month ago, we got a case when the editor of one of the biggest new media, Lenta.ru, was fired just because she refused to fire her reporter who reported from Crimea, from Ukraine. So now,
on what basis?
On the basis that the owner was not very happy with sensitive reporting. That's all. That was actually said quite openly. And now this news outlet absolutely destroyed because most of journalists decided to leave, and now it's absolutely different. Anyway, so the problem is that now if you try, given that you are Russian and you cannot speak and you cannot read English, how to get information, real, verifiable information about what's going on in Ukraine, I would say it's a big challenge. We have two websites which try to translate stuff from Western media. Maybe it's the only source of information we have. And especially we should remember that given all the social media and Facebook and Contact and how many false YouTube video we got with claims about columns of fascists hidden to, say, Donetsk to kill everybody, blah, blah, blah. So we have all this information, and people, we are not used to check this information, to be critical about the information. Mostly because Putin did his best to destroy political journalism in the country, and now even the middle classes, the most educated part of the society, are not used to talk about political things. We are not used to actually.
Just too dangerous.
It's not about dangerous. It's just about the approach to the information. We decided after, say, 2002, 2003, that we cannot trust anybody. We cannot trust the Kremlin. We cannot trust journalists. We cannot trust their position. And what you got when you have this lack of information, this vacuum of information, vacuum of trust, you got conspiracy theories. And when you have these conspiracy theories, for Putin, it's a great advantage, because now you can say there is someone behind. There is someone like CIA, Western powers, MI6, someone else. There is someone else who should be behind these events. And for the audience inside of Russia, it's a very understandable thing.
There's another question on here, different topic. What role does the media have in the negotiating process over Iran and its nuclear program? Any?
Well, that's my day job, doing the Iranian nuclear.
Well,
I mean,
take that one,
it has a
Julian.
much bigger role than it should have, really. I mean, if I was negotiating with Iran, I'd probably be saying much less to the media than the officials there are, in that probably they would get much further if they were locked away on an island and weren't allowed to leave until they reach some form of workable compromise. The leaks from the negotiations have hurt Zarif and Rouhani to a certain extent, but it's our job to find out what's going on, and we report it. In terms of inside Iran, it's very important. Actually, it's very important how the Iranian media project it, and the fact that Iranians can read what we write about it. That's also important, and it allows them to understand the kind of tightrope that Rouhani is walking, and so that's on the positive side.
The whole issue of Iranian nuclear project and the Western efforts to stop that under the threats of Israel to strike Iran is full with disinformation, and many or all the players are feeding the media, world media, with masses of false disinformation, and I think the media has a role to just dig up from all these bulk of material, to dig up what is true and present as much as it can, to present the facts as they are without going following Iranian lies or Israeli propaganda.
All right, do we have any more questions here in the room? I don't want to cut off our audience that is here.
Can't see anyone.
Nothing. All right. Let's talk, as we're starting to run low on time, about the future of investigative journalism. I'd like to just go down the line and just get your take. Hopeful, pessimistic? What do you think the future holds?
There are more people working as journalists now than have ever worked as journalists in the history of the world. And there's more money being spent on journalism than any time in the history of the world. It's unfortunately not being spent on the media that I grew up with, which was well-financed Western broadsheet newspapers, but it is being spent. There's more information around. There's more good information, there's more bad information. So it's never been a better time to be informed. There's never been more nonsense around. I think that investigative journalism doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists as part of other journalism. And I'm a bit suspicious of the idea of putting it on one side. Most journalism has some sort of investigative side. You're trying to you should be trying to find out something new. Otherwise, you're just a sort of PR person. I think that the danger of the future is that we just get swamped with stuff that looks important but doesn't. It's very easy. This documentitis of producing endless documents and endless anecdotes and stringing them together and saying that this is a story and the idea that because something's secret it must be interesting is all wrong. Secrets are mostly quite boring. Most official secrets, if you took the secret off and gave them to journalists, no journalist would be interested in printing it. But I'm broadly optimistic. It's become far easier. The internet has hugely increased journalistic productivity. We can do stuff now in a few minutes that used to take us a week to do. Unfortunately, journalists are essentially quite lazy, but that's another story. If we weren't lazy, we'd be doing a proper job.
Andre.
Well, I'm slightly pessimistic, mostly because journalism was as a whole compromised in Russia, and especially investigative journalism, and partly journalists should be to blame because, in the say mid-1990s, late 1990s, many journalists, investigative journalists were ready to accept money, and I should say that the Kremlin played very well with these things, and now if, say, I started my career in 1996, and then it was a very fashionable job, and if I come to the room, people were fascinated to find a journalist in the room. And now, if I come to the room, I try not to say people that I'm a journalist because I might face some strange question like maybe you can accept my $200 and you can write about my company, and that's become quite a common thing in Russia now. And also, I don't see much interest from the public. I don't see that. Well, even when we had some presumption some years ago that if we got some sort of crisis, political crisis, people get more interested in real information provided by journalists. When we got these Moscow protests in 2011 and 2012, I cannot say that we got much of, I don't see that actually people were interested in information provided by journalists. And even opposition people were not very interested, and again they blame journalists for many things, but mostly for the thing that we think is important is that journalists cannot take sides. Even for the opposition, it was not a very understandable idea. So that's why I'm quite pessimistic.
Julian.
What I'd say is that if you look at the period since the fall of communism, the end of it's probably the wrong phrase now, the end of the Cold War, a great victory for the Western democracy. Since then, our greatest strategic defeats, I believe, have been huge intelligence errors. Obviously, Iraq, the invasion of Iraq and all the bogus intelligence on WMD. The strategic defeat has been in the realm of soft power and the reputational damage caused by torture, Guantanamo Bay. In all those cases, the remedy or the essential counterweight, which was not strong enough in 2002, 2003 and run up to Iraq, was investigation journalism, especially in the US. It was a massive failure of US journalism in particular. I mean, there were more voices in the UK saying this is bogus than in the US, where they were very lonely. And I think that experience and the experience of the uncovering of the torture and the rendition and Guantanamo has woken up investigative journalism in the West. There are philanthropists who are now funding it. ProPublica, one of our partners who work on the Snowden, focuses solely on investigative and is funded by a private foundation. Greenwald has gone off to something that's been privately funded. Reuters has turned its to much more investigative. And
NAP just now.
NAP too.
Yeah.
I think people realise what what an important role it plays in a democracy. They've woken up to that, and I think that has strengthened it. And people find, although it is harder to get support for doing it in conventional media, people have found ways around it in order that it should carry on. And like Ed said, there are more people out there doing this stuff than ever before.
Ronan.
Unfortunately, my bottom line is quite gloomy. I don't know what is happening in India. Maybe people are paying far more to journalists, but the places I know, which is Israel, and something I know about the German press and the American one, suggests that there is less and less money to fund good journalists and give them time to work on one single topic and not demand them to give just regular reporting, news reporting, during 2 or 3 or 4 months. The situation as I see it is that the income from advertisement for the print has declined significantly. But if it was just that the readers moved to the internet and then you can publish there, that's wonderful. The readers did not move to the internet, the readers vanished. One of the editors of Ynet, that's the Yediot Ahronot website, said that they had made a survey of how long people scroll down when they read a long reporting, and the average was 400 words. Now, 400 words is an enlarged news piece. It's not even a feature, not to talk about huge reporting of investigative journalism. People stopped reading. In old times, people used to chase the content. Now content is chasing people. There's so much feed from so many places. People don't have the time. Everything is staccato, short, and to the point, and not more than 400 words. So in big places like the United Nations, like the United States or the United Kingdom, there will always be demand for premium product. But in smaller places like Israel, that demand will, unfortunately, I'm afraid, will not generate enough income to fund investigative journalism.
So what happens to you and others like you?
Well, I need to search for another job. But maybe I'll move to work for the Secret Services. And the bottom line is that even when you talk with people from major news outlets, media outlets in the States or in Germany or in Europe, they always come when you ask, what's your business model? Nowadays, when you combine print and online, when you go to all these online products for money, for free, do you have a viable business model? And as far as I understand, and I'm not a businessman, but as far as I understand, no one has come up with a reliable, viable profitable business model so far for investigative journalism, for any kind of news or reporting content. Sorry?
I don't know if I agree. I mean, there are different models. I mean, the New York Times model is to be kind of the dominant player on the block, to be so kind of essential to the American middle classes or the American elites that they couldn't imagine a day without it. The Guardian's strategy is to own other businesses that hopefully make the money that we lose and allows us to indulge.
That's not the
It is a bit. It works because we are carrying on. The mission of the Scott Trust is to be able to let us do our thing in forever.
So, but is that the future, investigative journalism, that it will have to be dependent on the altruism of someone?
No, not necessarily. I mean, the New York Times, it maintains its dominant position by doing great work, but there are fewer players, but there are different models out there, and the philanthropist with ProPublica is one of them. The other is the Guardian, where you own something else that does make money and cross-subsidize. There are various ways of doing that.
There's also if I could just make a very humble plug, the Economist has never in its history sold more copies or made more money.
Wow.
The New York Times fired their editor-in-chief. The Spiegel fired the editor-in-chief. If they were profitable, if they were making money, if everything was going smooth, there were other reasons why these people were sacked. But if these places were making money, they would never be let go.
The New York Times does make money. It makes, it's never enough for the investors, but it's
making, at least on someone working there, I can say that there's far less budget every month for investigative journalism, and you feel the stress.
We're spending more on investigative journalism than we've ever spent.
Us too.
Mm-hmm.
Us too. Because in a way, we think the future. Because you talk about 400 words. Yeah, that is the point. If you can find something that will condense, the main story into 400 words, very striking words, and it will go ricochet across the world, and your readership will balloon. But you have to put the spade work into finding that story that no one else has. And the competition engendered by the internet and the global internet means that you have to, if you're smart about it, put those resources into coming out with those stories that only you do, because only you have the resources and the commitment to do it.
All right. Any other questions in the audience before we say good night? All right, well, thank you, panelists, for coming. This was a fascinating discussion. Thank you all, everyone. Edward, Andre, Julian, Ronan. Could I have a hand for my terrific panelists? Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Right on time. Good.
Thanks so much. It was fun.
What a pro you are. Television.
I know. These are real skills.
In television, you have deadlines, and even a commercial comes on.
Yes.
And it said there were 5 more questions. I couldn't get them to come up. I kept tapping it. You have to see now. How would I have? And I tried scrolling, but it said it had said 5 more questions, and I was trying to make them move, and they wouldn't pop up. Yeah, it's all right. I tried. I don't have it.
That book on House Divided is a tremendous piece of analysis.
It wasn't political philosophy, but it was poetry.
Yeah. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to have a wide-ranging conversation on a subject that is of considerable interest and that extends well beyond the initial question of what's on everyone's mind these days, which is obviously Crimea, Ukraine, Russia. And the one who's going to guide us through this geopolitical consideration of the world around us is George Friedman. George is the founder and CEO of Stratfor. Rather than try to tell you what Stratfor is, I thought I'd ask George to tell us what Stratfor is.
Well, in 1996, when we founded Stratfor, we would never see war again and stuff like that. And the New York Times and the rest were leading it. And I thought it was time that many of the things that were in the world of intelligence be brought into the public. The internet and a bunch of other things made information cheap, easy to obtain. Analysis was crucial. Impartial, non-ideological, to the extent possible, objective analysis of what is going on in the world. And so we started Stratfor, and it was intended to be an intelligence organization using intelligence methods. Now let me draw a distinction between intelligence and espionage, which is well known in the CIA between the Director of Intelligence, which does analysis, and Director of Operations, which does the things that you would expect it to do. Intelligence does not mean espionage. It means looking at the world in a certain way, collecting information efficiently. It is about analysis. And that's what we did. We wanted to, in an age when information about the world was becoming less and less understandable, create a platform that we could use intelligence to serve the public. And as I like to say, it was what we called the learned public that we were appealing to, which is a term no longer used widely. But it meant it wasn't for Washington, it wasn't for foreign policy, people who made their livings at foreign policy. It was for people who were citizens and cared about such things. And that's what Stratfor
is. And then, of course, you're the author of a number of books. The most famous one is probably The Next 100 Years, which is actually a history of the 21st century of a kind, which is all the more remarkable for the 21st century not having yet unfolded. But at the same time, it is also a book that, in its earliest predictions, which is to say the ones that in which you discussed what might be happening by, say, the year 2014, it's a book whose predictions have been vindicated. And so why don't you tell us a little bit about your method in that book? What were you trying to do and how?
Well, there's a belief, particularly in the business community, that anything that's not quantitative can't be predicted. You can predict, many things. You can sit in a room and watch a man and a woman together and say they will fall in love. There are all sorts of non-quantitative things that you can do. And this was an attempt to show how we predict such things. And the way we predict it is in a very unsentimental way. The first thing to get rid of is hopes and dreams. And the second thing is to believe that the human condition doesn't change all that fast. That what happened in the past may well happen in the future. Not in the same way, but the same principles are at stake. And it began with a look at the post-Cold War world, which had three pillars: the United States, European Union, and China. And we looked at the United States. I looked at the United States. I say we because my wife really wrote it. She doesn't put her name on it for her reasons. We looked at the future of the United States, and it was clear to us that the United States is going to withdraw without victory from the Islamic wars, Iraq, Afghanistan, and some other lesser things. We looked at the European Union. I looked at the European Union, and it was unsustainable. At the center of the European Union was Germany, deriving 40% equivalent of its GDP from exports, using a free trade zone to overwhelm economies like Slovakia and others with goods that it could efficiently produce, creating a monetary system that made it almost impossible for smaller countries like Greece to get out of the way, and creating regulations in Brussels that made it very difficult to be entrepreneurial, very difficult to take risks, with tax structures that really didn't reward risk-taking. And we looked at that and said, well, this is going to end badly. You cannot have, if the United States exported 40% of its goods, could there be a NAFTA? That couldn't happen. When Germany arose, the United States allowed Germany to protect its markets from American goods, but allowed German goods to enter American markets. So it had an unbalanced trade. Germany, of course, had a very different system. And so we saw that that was going to end up in quite a mess. And then we looked at China, and we saw everybody announcing that China would shortly pass the United States, just as Japan had passed the United States in 1991. And we saw that there were structural reasons that couldn't happen. So we saw the end of the post-Cold War coming. We also thought that in the weakness of Europe, Russia would reemerge. That Russia was reconstructing itself anyway, and given the weakness of Europe and the low risk, the Russians would reemerge. And we published the book, and in it, at first I had, there will be a Russian invasion of Georgia. And before publication, I had to put it in the past tense, because the Russians had already reasserted themselves. So the method that we used was to simply take a look at the obvious. We have a rule at Stratford that says, be stupid. And by being stupid, do not begin by understanding, the most esoteric publications available in the world. By being stupid, we mean look at the obvious. Look at the fact that China has over 1 billion people who are deeply impoverished. Look at the fact that Greece and Germany cannot exist under the same monetary regime. That's an impossibility. And look at the fact that the United States is not going to win the war in Iraq in any conceivable way. And if you begin by being stupid, those things become obvious. And from that, we started to weave the story of the 21st century.
And also the author of a more recent book called The Next 10 Years. Which is harder, the next 10 or the next 100?
Well, if you have the next 100 under your belt, the next 10 kind of become logical. You may be wrong, but you can now bracket it somehow and say, and it was in that book that I really started speaking extensively about two things. An entente between the United States and Iran, which I think is currently underway, and also a Ukrainian crisis, because it was clear that Russia was going to reemerge and Ukraine was going to be the battleground that would emerge over time.
All right, well, why don't we cut to the chase in that sense and tell us now how we should be thinking about what's happening in Ukraine now.
Well, we first have to remember that nothing really enormous has happened. I know we're responding to it, but what happened here was what? Yanukovych was removed. One Sunday, I believe, a constitution was amended, and he left. Everything else stayed the same in Kiev. The Russians responded by invading Crimea. Now, the Russians, by treaty, had an enormous number of forces there. So invading Crimea essentially consisted of leaving the base and going across the street, and now they'd invaded. So when you look at it, Russia had suffered a massive defeat. They had if not a pro-Russian Ukraine, at least one that wasn't hostile. Now, their guy was gone. A government of sorts had been created in Kiev that clearly was entangled with the Germans, the Americans, and so on. They now had the Crimea, which they always had. In other words, they had nothing. And they started skirmishing in places like Kharkov in the east that had always been under their influence. From that point of view, if you understand it, the Russians had taken an enormous beating. Ukraine was fundamental to its national interest. For Russia to have survived Napoleon, to have survived Kaiser Wilhelm, to have survived Hitler, they needed depth. They needed buffer states. And the buffer states they had, on and off, were the Baltics, the Belarus, and above all, Ukraine. And Ukraine was also critical to them in terms of grain. Much of their military equipment is manufactured in Ukraine, a point missed by many people. They needed Ukraine. If Ukraine was not in their hand, if Ukraine, for example, joined NATO, two things would happen. Belarus could not remain independent. And if that happened, then Smolensk, which had been the center of Russia, was now a border town. A fairly stunning idea. Second, they were less than 100 miles away from Volgograd, Stalingrad. So one way to put it, as the Russians do, NATO would have come as far as Hitler did. Okay. If you are a Russian leader, this is not acceptable any more than having Texas join the Warsaw Pact would have been acceptable. These are fundamental things that can't be allowed. Now, the fact is that Russia suffered a massive defeat in Ukraine, and they're trying to recoup. The United States and the Europeans helped them greatly by making such a fuss over a non-event, the invasion of Ukraine, that Putin's polls soared as if he had been a great military hero. They made what were really minor events in the very easternmost part of Ukraine appear to be, some significant military operation. When, as far as we could tell, there was a few hundred drunks at any given time opening fire ineffectively. Well, these are the openings. This is the beginning of a struggle. Russia cannot abandon Ukraine. And it would be very nice to say, well, we'll let you have it, it's so important to you. But the problem is that intentions change, and having consolidated Belarus, which they control, and Ukraine, what next? The Baltics, perhaps? But certainly countries like Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, all of whom remember what it meant to be occupied by the Soviets, had to now do what in this region is essential, the worst case scenario. No one who has lived in this region, and I was born in Hungary, has any right to ever be hopeful. One must be prepared for the worst. And the reaction in this region has been, I think, appropriate. What comes next? Beyond this region and the rest of Europe, the United States, is a great deal of rhetoric. There's a great deal of meaningless threats, bringing sanctions on a foreign minister as if he cares. So we have these sanctions, which are primarily designed to appear to be action, but actually not do anything. And so we have to now understand where we are. We are 2 months into the post-Cold War world. We're 2 months into a period of time when the relationship between the United States and Europe and the Russians has changed fundamentally. But we're only 2 months in. This will go on for a while, and certainly will get more dangerous than it is now. But we have had the opening move, And you can tell that history has taken place, not because anything has happened, but the manner in which everybody suddenly redefined their view of the world. This was the important thing.
As we look ahead from where we are now, what do you see as the contours of this contest? What's coming?
The battle is really the Battle of Kiev. And by that I mean the Battle of the Kiev Parliament. The Russians are not going to invade Ukraine for two reasons. One, they can't. If you've ever tried to get 10 people to go on a picnic with you and get there at the same time, you know the difficulty of logistics. Moving 50,000 troops hundreds of miles is an extraordinarily complex thing, and the Russians are not particularly good at it, which is why they won't do that. The second thing is they think they have the advantage. First, the parliament in Kiev will be re-elected, but they expect it to be incapable of governing. Second, they're able to increase the price of natural gas as they wish. Third, Ukraine needs financial assistance. The IMF loans given by the West to Ukraine were there to repay Western institutions that held Ukrainian bonds. They helped ING and Templeton Fund and people like that. They didn't really help the Ukrainians. The Russians were prepared to give grants and loans and things like that the Ukrainians needed. The Europeans can't, because how can you give money to the Ukrainians and then squeeze the Cypriots, the Greeks, the Spaniards, and everyone else? They have an entire region that can't. And the United States certainly won't, for all that discussion. And so where this plays out as a political battle, if you remember in the Cold War, there were wars, but most of the battles were political battles in third world countries trying to control the regime, with each side bribing, manipulating, conniving, and all the things you'd want. So as a first stage, that will become, the step. If the Ukrainians can create a stable government that's impervious to outside manipulation, then it won't happen. If they could do that, they wouldn't have been in the situation they were before. And again, being stupid, I don't know why what was before will go away now.
Well, just to back up for a minute, if there had been a politician in Ukraine of exceptional brilliance and capability, how would that politician have played the Ukraine situation?
Well, firstly, I don't think he would have allowed a democracy to exist. The problem is that Ukraine is a highly fragmented country. Fragmented socially, fragmented along religious grounds, fragmented in many ways. In a democracy, what that means is coalition building, where the different fragments come together and build coalitions. These fragments don't easily form coalitions. And so, although I'm totally committed to constitutional democracy, and I would not like to live in anyone that wasn't, I do understand how dictatorships emerge. They don't necessarily emerge by psychotic people, wanting things. They emerge because they have a foreign threat. They cannot build a stable government at home. They either continue it and have that foreign threat overwhelm it, or they impose something. Lukashenko maintains a degree of independence in Belarus. He's not a nice man. He may not even be a sane man, but he maintains that. He gives away what he has to, he keeps what he can. I'm not sure it's worth it, but that's what he does. So if a brilliant politician would have done what the most difficult thing of all, impose a dictatorship and convince everybody it's a democracy. And that's hard. And Ukraine doesn't have anyone to pull that off. But there must be a powerful government in Kiev. There isn't a powerful government in Kiev, and therefore it will be a battleground.
If Kiev is the battleground, who are the contenders?
Well, I mean, the obvious first contenders are those who are pro-Russian, those who are pro-Western.
I thought, by the way, that you would appreciate a stupid question from time to time, just so we can be that one.
They're the best way to do it.
Yeah.
Second, there has to be an understanding that there are multiple religions. And secondly, there are class differences, oligarchs who are opposed to each other and find it very difficult to work together, form alliances, break them, and so on. So, I mean, these are the factions, and even more. And then there are the personalities who have ambitions and use the system to come an end. I mean, you can look at half the countries in the world and recognize this. This is not a uniquely Kievan or Ukrainian disease. But the problem is that they have the Russians on the one side and some fragmented entity called Europe on the other side, and they have to make their living. And there are some who long to be part of Europe and some who detest the idea of being part of Europe in that way. And so this is a country that is on the edge, which is what the name Ukraine means.
That's the internal conflict. Looking at it from the strategic point of view, who are the contenders?
For Russia, Ukraine is absolutely essential to its national security. I've already described to you what it would mean, but consider this. Between Ukraine, there's a flat ground. Between Ukraine and Moscow, you have a flat ground of about 400 miles to take it. Now, I want to stop here for a second and this down. I know that the European Union announced that all wars are archaic, but they're not. And if you are a Russian leader, and you remember the Second World War, you remember the Cold War, you understand two things: how quickly intentions change and how quickly capabilities change. In 1932, Nazi Germany was a cripple, militarily, socially, politically, economically. It had no intention of invading anybody. It hoped to be able to pay the electric bill the next day. 6 years later, a total of 6 years later, Germany was the dominant political, military power on the continent, threatening everyone around it and having Russia in its sights. What the Russians have learned, which is, I think, a fundamental truth that people who live in prosperous countries like to forget, is how dangerous the world is, how quickly it changes, and how you can't be confident in what's going on. And so a man like Putin, and Russia could only be ruled, I think, by a man like Putin, looks at Ukraine and says, if the West does not intend to do me harm, why are they so intent on bringing Ukraine into the West? And the West will answer, because we have dreams of making this a constitutional democracy. And to which the Russians answer, that is the least plausible of all explanations. So they look at the efforts the West makes. They look at the U.S. Undersecretary of State for Europe, Nuland, coming to Kiev and handing out cookies, of French and German foreign ministers, and the Russians say, this is very important to you. You've got a lot of people here. And so why is it important to you? Well, this is the beginning of the conflict. I think it's true subjectively that the West had no particularly bad intentions to the Russians in mind. Hard as it is to believe, I think the Russians, having been thoroughly surprised by what happened in Kiev, really didn't have any strategic, bad intentions. But when the Russians looked at the West, they assumed the worst. And when the West looked at Russia assuming the worst, they assumed the worst. And such are the way conflicts begin. And in this conflict now, the Russians are terrified about the reversal in Ukraine, are working to reverse that. And now the countries on the border of Ukraine are terrified of what will happen if the Russians do reverse that. And so at our meeting today, there was a great deal of talk about what Polish military policy would be, or Slovakian military policy, or Hungarian. And that was the first time in a very long time that I heard Europeans talking about this. And that represented a real change. And I think that's significant, because the strategic question is this. If the Russians control the Ukraine, and they control Belarus, they can project force against all these countries, if they wish. And in the past, they did wish. And if the West controls Ukraine, they can project force against Moscow, if they wish. And while we know we don't wish, they're not so sure. And that's the strategic foundation.
Let's break down the West a little bit, because I don't think this conflict looks the same, and I happen to know that you don't think this conflict looks the same from Warsaw as it does from Berlin or Paris. Who are the key deciders when policy decisions are going to be made about how to respond to this?
In this war, the key deciders are going to be Warsaw, Bratislava, Hungary, Bucharest. In other words, if these countries do not make a decision to build an alliance structure that can allow them to resist to some extent, then no other power, certainly not the United States.
I have to interrupt you here, because aren't these countries members of NATO?
Yes. NATO is a very, very nice place to have parties, cocktails, meetings like this. It is no longer a military alliance. A military alliance has two things. The first thing is the military. Second, a mission. The problem of NATO is that the Spaniards are not going to go to war or deploy forces in the Baltics. Any one country can prevent military action unless they're attacked. But nobody's going to build up their forces. The Europeans have drawn down their forces to the point that they can no longer project meaningful power. The French still have some, the British still have some. The British don't play with the Europeans, they play with the Americans, and the French play only with themselves. The real mystery here is what Germany's position is. This is the most important question of Europe. This is the most important question in the context of the European Union. What will Germany's policy be to the devastating depression that has gripped the Mediterranean part of Europe? What will it do? It is the wealthiest power. It has disproportionate control over the institutions of Europe. What will it do? Now we have the second question. The Russian question is now opened again. It was closed, now it's open. What will the Germans do? Because they are the potentially most powerful force in Europe. But what do the Germans want? They want everybody to go away and leave them alone. German national strategy is to ignore the crisis in Southern Europe and certainly not get deeply involved in a military adventure to the east. Therefore, since the western part of the European peninsula is not going to become engaged, and the Germans, who are dependent on Russian natural gas, show no inclination to get engaged, the only one who can get engaged is the United States. And the United States, you know, we haven't had a war in 2 years. It's feeling a little frisky here, guys. This is the United States you're dealing with. But the United States always comes into a war late and heavy, as I put it. In World War I, you first had the Tsar deposed. The Russian troops were eventually moving to the Western Front, and it looked like the Anglo-French would lose. The United States intervened 3 weeks later and declared war and sent 1 million men. It turned the tide, defeated the Germans, the Americans went home. In World War II, the United States really didn't do anything until the Soviets wore down the Wehrmacht, And their first really major action was at Normandy, at the North German plain, and they invaded Germany through that route. In the Cold War, it was the Germans that had the massive military force blocking the Russians. The Americans were a backup force, including nuclear weapons if necessary. And the answer is the United States will get involved under two circumstances. First, there's an existing viable alliance blocking the Russians who may need additional support, but who carry the primary burden. And it must be no other choice but that the Americans come in. They will come in those circumstances. Therefore, the real question here, we talk about the Visegrad countries, and we talked about a Visegrad battle group that for years has been discussed, but nobody really meant it. They weren't really going to build a battle group. Now, what happens to the Visegrad group? What happens to the line Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, maybe Turkey and out Azerbaijan, but certainly this line. These are political decisions that now have to be made in these societies by you. You were promised prosperity and peace by the European Union. Well, the prosperity is a little shaky. And now the question of peace is on the table. So now this is the question that confronts every liberal democracy. How will you defend yourselves? Will you do that? Do you have the will? And from my point of view, I'm not sure, but I think so. But this is the struggle we're going on. I mean, people are acting like we're deep into some conflict. We're not there yet. This has been 2 months. Nothing has really happened. But now the psychological question, Poland, I think, is prepared to make major commitments. I think Romania is prepared to make major commitments. Are you prepared to make major commitments? Are you frightened enough by the Russians to do this? Or do you think the Russians have no real intent? Or are you prepared to make your peace with the Russians? These are decisions that you have to make. And I will be very interested in watching you make them, and thank God that I moved to the United States so I don't have to.
I'd like to open this up if there are questions from the audience. Yes. Do we have a microphone? If you'll wait for the microphone, that way everyone will be able to hear, and I think we're also...
Thank you very much. My name is Konrad Muzyka. I am a defense analyst at IHS Janes, so the competitor. I'm going to start with a high tone. I think I would like to slightly disagree as far as...
I'm having trouble understanding, I'm sorry.
Sorry. I'm a defense analyst at IHS Janes. First of all, I would like to slightly disagree as far as Russian logistics is concerned. From what we know, yes, they do have problems with deploying troops abroad and maintaining them. However, it is possible, but it does require a significant effort, and Russia is progressing as far as its strategic mobility is concerned. However, my actually question is, what should the West do to deter Russia from further actions in Ukraine and Poland, or the Central Europe, maybe?
Part of that question depends on your assertion. The Russians have done a substantial amount since the 1990s to reconstruct their military force. But they still suffer from the fundamental problem that Russia always suffers militarily. It takes about a gallon of gas to move a tank 1 mile. That's not exactly right. And they have always had huge problems in armored formations. I remember back in the Cold War, watching them try to move large armored formations. It was a fuel problem. This may seem an esoteric technical issue, but it really raises the question, how long does it take for them to execute a military movement? I think the Russians have the most significant military force in the Ukrainian region today, which is not saying much. What actions should the West do? Well, first of all, let's get rid of the concept West. As I said, we don't have the Germans in any position. The Spanish and the Italians are not playing, and the United States has no commitment. There is no military force that is capable. The only scenario even vaguely conceivable against a Russian armored thrust into Ukraine would be American strategic bombers with anti-tank munitions. I would not even want to begin to think about the logistical problem of doing that. The answer is right now we have no options. We have political options, but no clear military options. But then the basic threat is not military from the Russians at this point. Right now, deterring the Russians is a very strange idea. They've suffered the defeat. They are nibbling away in the east. They hold Crimea. There is no major Russian action to reverse as yet. There may be one, but it isn't there yet. But the fact is that none of the European powers have sufficient force or force projection capability to intervene in Ukraine. The United States doesn't have the force projection capability to build up in Ukraine and defend it, and it's not going to anyway. The real question is not Ukraine. The real question is what happens on the line that I just defined. The Russians have the ability, ultimately, to redefine Ukraine as they want. The question is, what is the delimiting line? It is the question about containment that existed during the Cold War. So when I look at the problem, it really is what I ended with before. We need to understand, I think I know what the Romanians are doing, I know what the Poles are doing, I don't know what the Hungarians and the Slovaks are doing. How determining that is, I don't know. But at any rate, challenging the Russians in the Ukraine broke the back of Hitler and is not something that I would recommend anyone trying to do if they ever were at the military.
There's a question here in the front row. Would you just stand up so I can get the microphone to you?
Thank you. My name is Nikolai Beckfeldt. I'm with the GLOBSEC Young Leaders Forum, and I'm a first lieutenant to the Danish Army. I'd like to ask you, what do you think could be the ignition point for actually NATO troops to be deployed on a larger scale on this frontier that you're talking about, along this eastern line? How much would the Russians have to do? Like, choppers are being shot down in the eastern part of Ukraine. OSCE observers were kidnapped just a few weeks ago. What will be the ignition point, do you think?
Well, obviously, we haven't reached it yet, have we? The point I'm making is, what NATO? The Germans, when they went to Afghanistan, had to lease Ukrainian planes to get them there. The French, when they decided to go war in Libya, asked the Americans to provide AWACS planes and then fighter planes because they couldn't sustain a war in Libya that they started. The British have just cut their defense. One of the things that has to be faced is that the Europeans, having completely misread history, disarmed. If you ask the question, what will it take for NATO to deploy? The answer is an army. And they have one. It's called the American one. And the Europeans will first demand that the United States deploy, and once it deploys, will condemn the United States to human rights violations. We always enjoy the Europeans. They're such fun to play with. The United States is not going to go into Ukraine unless there's a prior major commitment, at least from the frontline countries, and certainly from Germany. There is not going to be a commitment from Germany. Germany is not prepared to risk anything for Ukraine. So the answer is, there is nothing at this point that could trigger a NATO intervention. But a very strong paper condemning the Russians is definitely possible. Maybe. if they could all get together to agree.
Is there one? Stand up if you have a question. Okay, great. Thank you. Yes.
No, thank you very much. I would like to ask, what do you think would prevail when the European Commission finally decides on energy partnership with Russia? Would it be more rhetorics or pragmatic interests? And how would the energy dependency of Baltic countries, of Eastern European countries, and pro-Russian government, for example, in Bulgaria, affect the decision-making process? Thank you.
Well, obviously, the Europeans face a severe problem. They have become heavily dependent on Russian, particularly natural gas, but also oil. They, I suspect, would have a lot more trouble living with an oil cutoff than the Russians would without having the money. They could last longer. And there's, of course, limits European actions along all fronts. In the short run, there is no good solution, no matter what the European policy is. I mean, this is a reality. And the policy, I don't know what difference it makes. The only meaningful midterm mitigation would be a pipeline through Georgia, through Turkey, that would draw Turkmen natural gas on a Trans-Caspian pipeline through Azerbaijan, joining it. Even that would not completely solve Europe's energy problems, but would mitigate it. The most significant potential mitigation of the problem is not something the European Union has nothing to do with, is the United States. The United States has revolutionized oil drilling, not just shale, but oil wells that no longer functioned. This technology is revived. I was out 3 weeks ago in West Texas, which is as desolate a place as you can find, but it's filled with oil wells. And the last time I was through there, nothing was working. And now in every field, the oil wells are pumping. The United States is approaching the point of being an exporter of oil. And if there's a technology that turns oil into gas, gas into oil, gas into liquid, that would also be revolutionary. The United States, however, also has a policy of not exporting gas, not exporting oil. And we adopted that during the oil crisis to make sure that we had enough. So the real question is not what the European Union's policy paper is. It's whether the US Congress will change the law on exporting energy. That would make a substantial difference. But up to that point, to answer the question of why the Germans won't do anything, well, they really don't want to become involved in military adventures. They have a bad memory of it, and they should. But it's also they have a dependence on energy. And, I mean, I don't know what is going to be proposed, but it is not a policy paper, but pipelines, sources of energy. These can ameliorate the condition in the Baltics. So the real question is, where can Europe get oil? And now Europe has passed rules against fracking, which was a particularly interesting thing for the Europeans to do from a national security point of view. So again, the Europeans have gotten themselves in a position in the short run that makes it very difficult to resist. The Russians know this, and they know they have a 2-3 year window of opportunity to restructure the former Soviet Union, and they're using it. In the long run, they're weak, but in the short run, they have a degree of control of events because of energy and other things that make it very difficult for the Europeans to counter.
Well, we're just past 7:30 now, and that's the wrap-up time. I, however, am going to assert a prerogative, and that's to ask you one more question, which is, our social scientists seem to think that there is a new phenomenon under the sun, and it's called the democratic peace. And concisely put, mature liberal democracies do not go to war with each other. I imagine you have a view on that.
They haven't gone to war with each other yet. It's not been so long since there have been mature liberal democracies. But I always raise this question. Germany in the First World War, yeah, it had a Kaiser, but its parliament had to vote money for the war. It had a free press, it had elections, it had philosophy, if that wasn't a liberal democracy, well, it wasn't a liberal democracy, but it was sort of a democracy. But it had an emperor, Britain had an emperor. It is hard to say that these weren't liberal democracies going to war. The passion of democracy can be a frightening thing. When the United States was attacked by Japan, or on 9/11, the passion of the democracy of the United States was frightening. Germany was a democracy who elected Hitler. When you look at the history of democracies, they have done terrible things. And to say that democracy declares not just a lack of wars, but decency, I think is hard to make the case. People talk about human rights. I like to talk about decency. Human rights is complicated. Decency is you don't put somebody in prison for 20 years for what he didn't like, what you didn't like his saying. But democracies can be repressive and brutal, and also wonderful places. And so I would argue that the claim about democracy somehow solving the problem of war probably isn't true, but that it avoids injustice is certainly not true.
Well, I'm Todd Lindbergh from the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and I thank you for joining us today, and I hope you join me in thanking George Friedman.
Thank you.